Thank you for inviting me to present this evening. I'm glad to be here. This is a beautiful area, it's a beautiful drive down. I always love coming to the Kickapoo Valley Reserve. And so tonight, as the title says, I'm going to talk about flood forecasting in the Driftless region. It's very challenging as a meteorologist, flood forecasting in this area. We've been seeing frequent intense rainfalls in this area. Plus we have the terrain that we there's some problems there as well, just due to the steep terrain. So we get rapid runoff and get into those details here in a moment. So before I dig into the meat of the presentation here, just kind of wanted to go over the water cycle, give you some background on how water flows over the landscape. Essentially, you have precipitation. It can be in the form of rain, snow, hail, drizzle, you name it, all the different types of precipitation that you see. That falls on the landscape. If it's in steep terrain, it flows off more quickly. Also, if the soil's wet, it flows off more quickly. That precipitation makes its way through rivers and streams. Some of it soaks into the ground. Some of it even evaporates. But eventually it makes its way into the river and into a lake system or a puddle or a pond. It could be that as well. That evaporates, goes back up into the atmosphere. You get condensation and you start the process all over again. Then you produce precipitation and clouds. As a meteorologist and a hydrologist, our challenge is to determine if and when there's going to be precipitation. So we model the atmosphere and try to resolve what's happening in Mother Nature, if you will. Also plants, you get transpiration from plants. They can also take some of the moisture out of the soil, and that also can be evaporated into the atmosphere, kind of adding to the water vapor that's present. And that cycle just continues over and over and over again, also known as a water cycle or hydrologic cycle. You may have heard that term before. So as I kind of alluded to here already, in the Driftless region, we have very steep topography. From this area, you're aware of that. Also known as the coulee region. Sometimes we'll discuss it as that. And when I first moved here, actually for my job interview to come here to the Weather Service in La Crosse, my boss, he says, "This area is called the coulee region. Do you know what a coulee is?" I said, "I'd never heard of a coulee before." It's like, okay, it's a French word for a shallow ravine or valley. So I learned that moving here. Actually, before I moved here, I was still in South Dakota, and I learned that. There's complex terrain across the area. You see that. Numerous valleys. You see elevation differences between 400 and 700 feet. So some of these areas where the water drains off the steep terrain, it almost acts like mountain streams or mountain rivers, if you can think of it that way. That leads to rapid runoff during heavy rain and fast snowmelt events. So it's not just tied to thunderstorm season during intense rainfall. If it gets really warm or it rains on snowpack with warm temperatures, it's kind of the worst case scenario. You can start releasing a lot of water from the snowpack. And there is a threshold when that'll happen. It just doesn't, you can see that as the snowpack will shrink. So that's another modeling challenge. I won't get into all the details of that, but that also goes into river forecasting. Rock slides and mudslides is another hazard. And you start to see more and more of that with the more precipitation you see in the area, the more moisture you're adding to the soils. Even sometimes in the winter months if you have wet soil conditions, and you start freezing some of those soils, that can release some rocks and cause some issues as well. So here's just kind of zoomed in on the upper reaches of the Kickapoo Valley, basically from Ontario down towards Viola. And that tends to be some of the most extreme terrain across this drainage basin. Just kind of zooming in there to give it some perspective. So how do we monitor river levels across the region? And across the United States for that matter. How to kind of start off with that before digging into the forecasting. Well, there's thousands of river gauges and streams across the nation. Don't pay too much attention to the colors here on this graphic. That has to do with the expected stream flow conditions, but just wanted to show the points here, just how many river gauges there are. It looks like a lot when you're zoomed out like this, but when you really zoom in, there's areas that don't have not every single stream. A tributary has a river gauge on it, unfortunately. If it did, that would be great. That would be ideal. But that's not the case. they can become expensive at times to maintain, and it's a very involved process maintaining those gauges. So they can't be placed everywhere, unfortunately. The gauges are installed and maintained by many different agencies. It's really a partnership. Those agencies, including the National Weather Service, we all work together in learning where these river gauges are, sighting of the gauges, and sharing data and information on those. So it's not just we forecast the river levels, it's really a partnership with other agencies and local government and organizations for that matter. So river forecast, kind of give you an overview of the components of the National Weather Service, 8 agents or groups, if you will. The river forecasts, actually, they originate from a river forecast center, and there's 13 across the nation. There's only 12 shown here in this map. The 13th one is Alaska. So these are all the different basins covered by the different river forecast centers across the country. The river forecast center that services this area is a North Central River Forecast Center located in Chanhassen, Minnesota. So we work real closely with them, providing our local input, our local expertise, our local knowledge of the area. So the weather, this is a breakdown of all the different weather service offices across the country. I think there's 122 in total. Here's La Crosse, and you see the different shapes. That's called our warning areas, or the counties that we service. Not necessarily broken down by state lines. More has to do a lot with radar coverage and partners present in the area. So it's not just a one-way street here that the River Forecast Center comes up with a river forecast and sends it to us and we just send it out. Nope, they send it to us, we look at it, we provide our input, and then we collaborate, coordinate those forecasts, and then send them out. So the river forecasts, what do they look like? Well, here's a kind of a zoomed in version of that previous map that I showed. This is from we call it the AHAPS or AHPS. Basically, it's a way to combine river and hydrologic information and view it. So that's one of the best ways to look at a river forecast. I have an example in this example, I just pulled this off the web the other day. Steuben was in flood, so let me back up just a second here. What do all these shapes mean? These are all river gauges. What do all these shapes mean? Essentially, the circles and the squares are where there are river forecasts available. So there's not river forecasts for every one of those river gauges. The diamonds are where there's only observations. So we can use that information to put into the river models and to monitor river levels, but there's not necessarily a forecast generated for that location. So what do the river forecasts look like online? If you go to that website, that's one way to look at them. You can also get river information from the USGS's website. There's others out there as well. I just pulled up an example of the Weather Services page. Here's the forecast, clicking on that point for Steuben. The forecast is this trace here on the map, or on the graphic, and here's the current river level. What's the rainbow colors? What does that mean? That's essentially the different stages, and that's part of my job, is to go to these locations or different stages of the river levels, be action, minor, moderate, major flooding. So essentially all action stages, it means it's kind of a heads up, watch out situation for us. Going to start generating forecasts, the rivers are coming up. Not going to issue a warning unless we're forecasting it to hit minor flood stage or the river's already reached minor flood stage. So I'll actually go out there and do surveys of this and determine what those should be, and also get input from local emergency management and other government agencies. And past flooding is a great example of that. You can kind of get a good feel for what the impacts are going to be, what level of flooding can you expect at that location. So on this particular day, the river level was already into minor flood stage, and then this was what we're expecting it to do based on the forecast from the River Forecast Center and our collaborative forecast. Yeah, absolutely.
When you go out, what do you mean you go
Yeah, what do I mean when I go out and survey? What I'll do is I actually take survey equipment and measure the elevations around the site. So I'll get a baseline based on known points around the river gauge. So then I can kind of baseline what elevation I'm at. And literally we'll go out and take a stick, if you will, and measure the elevation at that, just using a stadia and a sight, and we'll look at what level that's at, so we can anticipate if the river gauge, I know I'm at the 0 reading based on the elevation and where the river gauge is located, and I can get an idea where that water would be at that particular level. And that can change over time too, due to if you have a big flood, you've built up a lot of sediment in one area, if there's been construction in the area, maybe a bridge has been put in or a dike system, that can change those impacts. So those are reviewed on a regular basis.
So
yes.
You're saying that there's no sensor in the region to measure the river height. It's actually a physical person going to the site and measuring.
There is a sensor in place there. It's this we go out to establish where we think. We'll go out to establish these different impact levels, if you will. Like, when should we issue a flood warning for this area? Are there any impacts there? Is it just spilling into a marsh and not going into a community? So probably doesn't need a flood warning, but if it gets a little higher, now we think it's going to start spilling out of that marsh area and start impacting a community. So maybe we'd set that particular measurement at minor flood stage. If it's really going to start impacting a community, a threat to life and property, we'll want to consider going higher with that.
Where in the Kickapoo Valley are the gauges located?
Currently, we have Ontario, there's Lafarge, then we have Reedstown, Viola, Soldiers Grove, Gaze Mills, and Steuben.
Gaze Mills has one?
Those are actually manual observations, though. So that's a case where it's not an automated gauge. There are some that are not, and those are known as they're wire weight gauges. So actually, somebody has to physically go out on the bridge, and they lower down. It's a weight on a wire, and there's a gauge that'll tell them what the reading is, and they'll just touch the surface of the water, call us, and then we'll put that into the database.
And what other kind of gauges are there?
There's radar gauges, which will actually send a signal down to the water surface and bounce back, and by calculating that distance, it knows what the river level is at. And then there's also what's known as a pressure transducer. Basically, it's a tube that goes into the river channel, and that can also, just due to the different pressure effects on that sensor, it can get a measurement of what that river level is. And that's where it's really important for agencies like the USGS to go out and actually take flow measurements to know how much water is going past that location at a specific stage or a specific river level.
And so the ones in Ontario, Lafarge, Viola, Reedstown, what kind of gauges are those?
Lafarge that's automated from the USGS. Ontario is also automated from the USGS. Viola that's a manual reading. And Soldiers Grove and Gaze Mills, those are manual readings. And we have Reedstown. I think I left Reedstown out the last time. That's Weather Service gauge, Reedstown. So we maintain that gauge.
So the gauges measure just the height of the water, or do some of the gauges also measure flow rate? But how does the flow rate figure into your prediction?
Okay, so the gauges measure height or flow or both. They'll measure both, but how we establish that flow information is based on like a measurements, flow measurements at that location, calculating how much water would be moving through that area at what the river gauge is reading. So if, say, just throw a number out there, say the river gauge is reading 8 feet. Well, what does that mean? Until it's actually, you go out there and make those calculations and those measurements to know what the volume of water is moving through that area. That's what's key to knowing the flow. That's what's key to modeling the rivers, and knowing how much water is moving through a location at a specific level.
So August, last year, unfortunately, I was not subscribing any apps, I had no business intelligence on that stuff. So now I'm more equipped to plan. So when you forecast, and we get notified with a text or
No, we send it.
24/7?
Yep, we're there 24/7, and there'll always be somebody there sending that warning out. It's not an automated process. When we send out a flood warning, it could be flash flood warning, the different types of flooding. That's somebody actually sending that information out. We're physically there.
Located in the area, or they're just somewhere in your forecast center?
Where do they go?
Are they local?
Where are we located? Yeah. Who's sending that information?
Okay, you're in La Crosse?
Yes. Yep. Exactly. We're sending that information from La Crosse, or it could be another weather service office outside of our coverage area.
And then you partner with like NOAA and, like for example, I get the NOAA app and.
Yep. We're part of NOAA.
Information through the different sources and.
Yep. That'll go out to the emergency alert system, weather radios. Go out on. You'll hear them on like a flash flood warning. You'll hear that on the television, radio, emergency alert system, weather radio if you have it. Phone, actually, you probably have those before it issue a flash flood warning. If you have the wireless emergency alerts turned on, it'll trigger on your phone. If you're outside of radio and cell phone coverage, that's where it's really challenging. Being able to get warnings. RFC. So one thing about the more and more you work with different agencies, you start developing these acronyms, start abbreviating things. That's river forecast. So the river forecast models. What are those? Well, the river forecast uses a model called CHIPS. There's another acronym, Community Hydrologic Prediction System. It's a very complex modeling system that has many different components. It models, some components of that include snow accumulation and melt, soil moisture, how much is going to run off, a unit hydrograph and runoff, reservoirs, and if you start really digging into the details of the modeling system, there's a lot of components to it. Like the snow model, it's a whole other model in itself. The soil moisture model, that's another one. And so that's how the model is coming up with its idea of how much water is going to run off if this much rain falls. How much water is going to be released from melting snow. And what can be expected from that. And this is another thing that isn't just automated. There's a forecaster at the River Forecast Center watching these. If it's not matching reality, the model's not capturing it, they're providing human input and making the necessary adjustments when they do a pretty good job, but you can't just flat out automate a model trying to model a natural process like that's that complex. It takes human interaction. We have a model that we run ourselves as well. It's not as robust and complex as the CHIPS model. That CHIPS model takes in a lot of information, and with that, it needs time to calculate that information. So a good example is on the Kickapoo River at Ontario. It's a rapidly responding site. That's an area where we may not have a lot of time to wait for model output to come in for that. So then we use a model that is useful in generating forecasts for a site that responds quickly. Usually it's what we call the headwaters or your most upper reaches of a river system. So there we go in, provide our own local expertise. It gives us some settings based on some other model inputs, what it thinks it should be, as far as how much runoff's occurring, how much precipitation fell. That's where we can go in and make those adjustments and come up with the river forecast based on what we're observing and then what we're expecting based on precipitation or runoff, anything that would flow into the water system to increase those river levels. So I'll get into now what are the ingredients for flooding? When can we anticipate that we're primed for flooding or potential's there for flooding? Well, a lot of the ingredients that go into that, especially in our area, it's heavy rain. Obviously, that's a big one during the summer months, during thunderstorm season. It's quite amazing how you may not even have that wet of soil conditions, but if it's intense enough rainfall, it just doesn't have time to soak in, especially in this area with the steeper terrain. It'll run off quickly. A prolonged rain event. Sometimes now that we're getting into the fall season here, we can get into these weather systems where we just have rain for days and days and days, and then we start having some issues from river flooding, just prolonged rains. Example of that, would be last year just to the south of us in the Davenport area. We had all that snow melt coming down the Mississippi River, all that water coming down, and then it started raining just several days in a row on top of that, adding more and more water to the system. So it went from already significant flooding to nearly record flooding in some areas. So that kind of goes along with that already elevated river and stream levels. Basically, there's just nowhere for the water to go. If your river's already running high, you add more to the system, it just can't take any more, and you'll start having flooding issues. Wet or frozen soils are a big one. Our spring snow melts, that's usually when we end up with issues. The deeper the frost, the longer we'd be dealing with the runoff. And last year we had a situation where we had very wet soil conditions, very cold temperatures before we had snowpack on those wet soils, and we ended up developing a pretty deep frost layer that increased the runoff, made the flooding worse than it would be if the frost was shallower. Some other local flooding factors, the complex terrain, moist soil conditions, increase in, and also we've seen an increase in heavy precipitation events. You look at some of the historic floods we've had across the area, and many of those have occurred in the last 10 years. 2018, our big record-setting year. 2008 was another bad one. I mean, there's just several. I was going to cover some of those historic floods, but there's getting to be so many of them within the last 10 years. It's quite amazing. I grabbed an image of the U.S. here, just showing soil moisture conditions. Now, this is a soil anomaly. So where you see the greener colors, that's the more anomalous. That's how much more wet or wetter than it should be. And in the orange and yellow areas, that's where it's much drier than what you would typically see. So this was just looking conditions on September 23rd since August 31st. So where we had our heavy rain events, it really starts to key in on those areas. So those are areas we're really concerned about. Even going into this weekend, if we get any more rain on this area, an area south, I mean, the soil moisture it's so high that we're going to have runoff issues. So that's one way we can gauge what the runoff potential is in the area and how primed we could be for flooding if heavy rain occurs or rapid snowmelt. So I grabbed some examples of just from this past year here of primary local flooding causes. One of the biggest ones is heavy rain from thunderstorms. This spring snowmelt, this was actually a picture from the Trempealeau River in Dodge last spring. We had some rapid snowmelt, we had deep snowpack, still a lot of snow in place, a lot of ice in place. So that's our typical snowmelt issues. Along with that, we can have ice jams. Those are pretty frequent. The nice thing about the ice jams, forecasting those, is that they tend to occur in the same areas year after year. There's just areas where once the ice starts to break up in the river systems in the spring months. This can happen earlier too, as the river's freezing up. You can have ice jam issues, but they tend to occur in the same area. So we watch those closely, and we actually have ice jam observers that know what to look for, know what to report to us, and they'll go out and look along the rivers if we suspect there could be an ice jam forming. Another one was the repeated rounds of rain on saturated or frozen ground. That's another one. You tend to see those. I mean, they can occur any time of year, but tend to see more of those in the spring and in the fall months. So we also have different types of flooding. There's flooding that happens really fast, and then there's flooding that doesn't happen quite as quickly. More time to respond as far as getting out of the areas that are under threat for flooding. So the National Weather Service, we categorize flooding basically by the onset time. How much time do you have before you'll see flooding? Flash flooding, it's less than 6 hours. That's the technical definition for it, but a lot of times it happens much faster than that. It's just a matter of hour, 2 hours. If the rain falls heavy enough, it'll flood in much less time than 6 hours. Essentially, flash flooding, rapid water can rise is rapid, and water can rise very quickly in a very short period of time. And then that's when we would issue a flash flood warning. Flood warning, there's still a threat to life and property. you're not quite as high of a risk as in a flash flood situation, where if you don't get to higher ground, basically your life could be in serious danger. Where flooding, it's just a longer onset time. Still a threat to life and property, but there's more time to respond. That would be a situation where maybe that would be in the river forecast. We'd say, okay, we're expecting to reach flood stage out in the next 2 days, 3 days, and there's more time to respond to that. But flash flood situation, you don't have that. So there's this is the highest level of flooding, and this is pretty rare, kind of a subcategory, if you will, of a flash flood. It's called a flash flood emergency. And this, it's a relatively new term to a lot of citizens because it hasn't been around all that long. Essentially, though, if there's a flash flood emergency, I mean, you're likely already experiencing flooding, and it's getting worse. It's going to be a historic event, a rare event. You're going to see water in places you've never seen before. I mean, literally, there could be a dam failure or a levee failure, and there's literally could be a wall of water approaching your community. Last year, a good example of one of those would be the Coon Valley, the Coon Creek drainage. We had a flash flood emergency for that area, and even the upper reaches of the Kickapoo. So that's one area where we're doing more research in to see what signals are we seeing in radar data, what reports are we getting to say this, okay, it was a flash flood, it was already life-threatening, but now this is a whole other level. It's like this is going to be a historic rare event. And yes? I'm sorry, could you repeat that? The levee been repaired to this? These there has been some repairs. A lot of these. I think this was Jersey Valley. I think that was the reservoir.
Wide open, pending a potential funding of a study by NRCS to do a big watershed study to decide if the dams should be put back or if they'll some other idea will happen.
Yeah, to decide if the dams should be put back. I have not. I'm not all in the loop with that right now at the moment, since I just moved into the hydrologist position. That's a possibility. Maybe they're working on that. I know there's been a few communities that have, at least one that I saw on the news, that had replaced. I don't know if it was Portland. It may not be. I may be wrong on that, but they had okay.
It's a city dam.
Okay, I saw that they replaced that. So yeah, that's an interesting question to see what It's kind of there's there's a benefit to that. You're holding some of that water back, and then if you get in an extreme event, it's at some point, there's dams out there that if you have a really intense extreme rainfall event, it just can't handle it.
So you say that a flash flood emergency as opposed to just a flash flood warning, is kind of a new thing?
Yes.
So does that reflect some level of difficulty that the agency is having in accurately predicting how that rain is going to behave or what the amount of it will be, if it stalls out, trains over an area, parks? What is that? Why do you have a new designation, or what has changed?
That is to heighten awareness of the urgency of the situation, basically the flash flood emergency. That if you think about it, this area is under, you get several flash flood warnings a year, and you probably, if you're not right by a river, stream, or an area that floods, you think, okay, there's another flash flood warning, I'm up on the hill, I don't have to worry about this as much. But if you try to travel anywhere, it could be a different story. The flash flood emergency, I mean, that's the heightened awareness thing. This is a rare. This is a rare event. This is extremely dangerous, life-threatening situation. Basically, your life's in danger if you're anywhere that has ever had flooding before and you're having heavy rainfall. That this is a higher level of flooding than just a flash flood warning. That's life-threatening, but this is much worse. So these could be issued for dam or levee failures. Maybe that's possible or occurring. We at the Weather Service will start hearing more reports of more people trying to get people out of areas. Maybe there's water rescues occurring. We know the rain's continuing to fall. And now it's just going to keep continue. It's going to get much worse, a whole other level of flooding. And I'll show some examples here, some of the data that we're looking more closely at to aid us in detecting that kind of a situation.
So, excuse me, when you issue an flash flood emergency or any of these things, it's always for like a specific area, right?
Yeah,
Like a Kickapoo Valley area or something like that.
it would be for a more specific area. It's not a widespread, larger type of flood warning. It tries to target often a particular community, because to get that level of flooding, it usually isn't real widespread, at least that rapid of flooding. I mean, once it gets into the river systems, it can, you can still get historic flooding, but a slower onset, where the flash flooding is a very high-end flood, very intense flood in one particular area. So since we're kind of going down that road talking about flash flood emergencies and historic floods, I thought I'd just provide kind of a brief summary here of what we saw, the historic flooding August 27th to 28th of 2018, and how much rain fell across the area. The graphic on your right, this is a rainfall map. Basically, anywhere you start seeing these reds, or even over to the maroons, there was 4 to 6 plus inches of rain in those areas. This was a 2-day total, but a good portion of that rain fell during the overnight hours. We saw well over 8 inches. I believe it was upwards of 10 inches in some areas. There's not a rain gauge. Every square mile would be ideal to capture all that, but that's information that we're seeing on. This was observed. We're getting radar estimated rainfall that time in the end of night. I mean, sometimes we do see that on automated gauges. We'll see how much rain has fallen, but a lot of that is being estimated by the radar, and then incorporating some of that rainfall gauge information. And then getting real-time observations of rainfall that time of night is difficult as well. That's where it's so important. We're hearing reports from law enforcement agencies, those that may be out that time of night responding or checking on things. We'll start getting reports from them on what kind of flooding they're seeing and what's unfolding. This is, again, kind of going back to our hydrograph, or our graphic showing the river levels and river forecasts in different stages that we've established. This was the Kickapoo River at Ontario. I believe that was right around the time we lost the gauge. So there you see the blue, yep, the water overtook the gauge. This blue line going up, that's how quickly it climbed. And that's a classic flash flood on a hydrograph. I mean, in just a matter of a few hours, you went from essentially the rivers where it normally is at to well above moderate flooding and right on into record flooding, and then the data went out, and then we knew it must have overtook the gauge already. So that was a record, 22.11 feet. That gauge has since been moved up onto the bridge, so it's quite unprecedented when you start seeing flooding of that magnitude, where you're overtaking river gauges that have been in safe spot for many years, to start seeing that. So certainly seeing more intense flooding events. So how do we forecast these flooding events? Well, leading up to it, we look at computer model data. This is a little different than I talked about the River Forecast Center model. That's different. That's actually modeling the river. This when I say computer model data, I'm talking about modeling the atmosphere. What's the atmosphere capable of it, or what's the potential different types of weather we could see in the atmosphere. Also, we'll incorporate observations of weather and current hydrologic conditions. I showed that soil moisture map. That would be an example of a hydrologic condition, wet soils. Okay, we know if we get rainfall tonight, it's likely going to all run off, or a large portion of that's going to run off.
How are those soil moisture maps generated?
I think they actually have sensors out there, and then I think there's even some modeling that goes into that as well. It actually does a pretty good job. So it's taking into account what's fallen, and then there's sensors that are actually measuring soil moisture, and there's some modeling that goes into that as well. I'm certainly not an expert in that area, but it It does work very well. Gives us a good feel for what kind of runoff we can expect, how much runoff we can expect during heavy rains. Here's where the challenges come in. The exact location of flash flooding can be difficult to forecast. Why is that? Well, it's thunderstorm processes in general. Locations of thunderstorms are difficult to predict, to pinpoint beyond that time range of 3 to 6 hours. You get under a tornado watch or severe thunderstorm watch, that covers a big area. You're not always impacted by storms when you're in a tornado watch or severe thunderstorm watch. That's why it's okay. Atmospheric conditions are favorable. We think storms are going to develop, but not everyone in that watch is going to be impacted. So that's if everything else is lining up, we see the atmospheric conditions are there, the soil conditions are there. There is a potential to see flash flooding. We're about 50. We could be 50-50, maybe a little more than that. Confident, not quite sure if we're going to see it or not. If what's going to push us one way or the other to do a flash flood watch? Okay, it's maybe the soil moistures are a little more wet. The atmosphere is holding a little more water vapor or water today. Potential for heavy rainfall is greater today, and that's where we will do a flash flood watch. But still, the issue is from there is exactly where do we go from there? We know we're primed, but where are the storms going to track? That's where it becomes challenging, and that's where the job of the forecaster is key. The human forecaster, not just a model spitting out data saying, hey, I'm predicting heavy rain in this area. Okay, let's issue a flash flood watch. No, it's not like that. We have the humans there watching it. So I grabbed an example. This was our storms from last evening, actually. This was forecast model data. It's trying to depict 9 different models, the placement of precipitation. So the green values and lighter green are lighter precipitation, and the blues and purples and reds and oranges are heavier precipitation. So just kind of looking at all that different model output, that's what we see as forecasters. Where's the heaviest rain going to fall? Well, you can start seeing there's maybe more of a signal. This is north central Wisconsin, and maybe there's more of a signal there. And I think I grabbed this information was about, let's see, it would have been about, I think 8 hours to the onset, 8 or 9 hours to the onset of storms last night. So I didn't go back. I should have grabbed an image when I got back to the office here this afternoon and kind of verified where the heaviest rain fell. But I know we had pretty intense storms over north central Wisconsin, so it was capturing that. But further to the south, maybe not quite as much. But then as a forecaster, is which one of these models do you put more weight in, or do you throw them all out? Say none of them are handling it. And then there's times that can happen. I mean, you just know by experience and through training that under this pattern, we typically see this. The model isn't resolving what we're expecting to happen. So it's a challenge. It's certainly not an automated, just an automated process that you can just roll with from model output. And it seems like we continue to add more and more models all the time. Some are better in areas than others. There's strengths and weaknesses to each model. Yes?
I just want to say, as a user of your forecast, I really appreciate the forecast discussion that talks about some of that nuance.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Really helpful to have that kind of background in the forecast.
Yeah.
Good.
I agree.
Good. Appreciate that feedback. That's good. Because that's where our forecast discussions. If you see those, they're available on our website. There's other websites that have them as well. I think there's even some apps that you can get access to those forecast discussions. That's where we're putting in our thoughts of why we think a model may be handling it better, why we think they're not handling it at all, what do we think is going to happen, where do we think the highest threat is, the highest risk is, what's the precipitation type going to be. It's endless the amount of information we can put into that, and that's where we can put our thoughts that you can't necessarily see in the finished product when we send out our forecast. Okay, this is what we think is going to happen today, but you have to look at it from a probabilistic sense too. It's like what's the chance of an area seeing heavy rain? If we thought, okay, 100% this model, we're all in. We put out a flood warning right then and there. We don't have that much confidence. So, but maybe we're more than 50-50 on it. Maybe we'll say, okay, now it's watch time. Let's put out a watch. Could be a flood watch, winter storm watch, whatever kind of watch it may be. That's where our confidence is starting to creep up that we think that could happen. Okay, so kind of adding on to that forecast challenge I grabbed, this was the evening, 7 p.m. what the radar looked like leading into our record flooding along the Kickapoo Valley and Coon Valley area. And this is what we were working with that evening. Line of severe thunderstorms. We had damaging winds with that. We knew there was a potential for a flash flood threat too as the night went on. The question was just exactly where does this line of storms decide to stop, just to stop progressing, stop moving, and start to actually the training or repeat thunderstorms. Where does that happen? So this line of storms continued to progress across the area, and we even had some at least one tornado with that line of storms. Finally, this line of storms kept progressing southeast, 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 and then finally it decided that's it. That's all the further south that line of storms was going to sink, and the storms kept repeating over those same areas. Earlier that day, I was working the night shift the night before, trying to predict where this was all going to happen. A lot of the forecast models had this occurring, but up here, way up to the north of Interstate 90. And then as the day went on, those models started to catch on, saying, no, it's going to go further south. And just from us kind of seeing where we're expecting the frontal boundaries to be positioned, and that can change based on how these thunderstorms evolve. Just because the front's sitting there, it's not like, okay, the front's just sitting there, that's where the heavy rain's going to be. As these storms roll through, that changes where that's going to be. So, and that's kind of what happened here. It essentially pushed a warm front further south, and instead of it hanging up here north of I-90, it ended up hanging down here and putting all the heavy rainfall right into the Kickapoo Valley. And then this was just round one. We had another round right after that. And this was just the overnight leading into the Coon Creek flash flooding as well, and the flash flood emergency. So what are some tools that we use for flash flood warning? And I covered this mainly because I think this is the highest threat to life and property is flash flooding. We look at radar data. Observations are great. I mean, that's where it's at. Real world observations are perfect, but they're not always available, especially late at night. Most folks are sleeping, and just it can be hard to get those. So radar data, along with flooding, we started getting flooding reports, rainfall reports from our partners, our cooperative observers are the main tools that we use in flash flood warning operations. Grab some examples of, again, here's that precipitation. So we're seeing that on radar. That's just the radar estimated rainfall. That's kind of the same thing that we looked at on that other graphic, but this was just what the radar had estimated. And it actually did a pretty good job. One of the challenges the radar, or some of the, it's almost kind of like a model that the radar will try to, what the radar senses, it puts the input into this pseudo model, if you will. It has to make a determination, is it rain or hail? And sometimes when you get really intense thunderstorms, sometimes that model will think, okay, this is hail. I'm seeing this much radar echo. I'm going to classify it as hail. And if it isn't hail, it can almost double the amount of rainfall if it's not hail. So we have to be watching that closely and know if that's happening. And a model that's a great tool that works with that radar data that's collected is a model known as FLASH, or flooded locations and simulated hydrographs. So it'll take in that rainfall information, and also what it'll also do is model some soil moisture conditions too, as it continues to rain in an area. So it's becoming more saturated. It'll start increasing its runoff. We can get a feel for what level of flooding we could see, or if we're going to see flooding. And here is an example of that. This was some local research that was conducted by a couple of my colleagues here back in 2017, and they're still adding to this database, and I'm starting to look more at this research as well. So what we're trying to do is identify the impacts based on guidance from that flash data, or you can almost think of it as a model. And this is one example, one example output from the Crosse max unit streamflow, it's called. Essentially, it's showing you what the amount of water flowing off into the different drainages and different river systems. So there's, see the different colors here again, there's specific thresholds that we're starting to look more closely at when we can start anticipating flooding and what level of flooding. So what we have found when we start seeing these yellow and orange colors in our data, that okay, flooding is starting to happen. We're starting to hear some impacts. We're hearing flooding reports. But then this can guide us along with radar estimated precipitation and reports. This isn't a one-stop shop. You have to use this with other data. So you can probably heard this before. It's another tool for your toolbox. You can't just use one data set alone. But if it's handling the situation well, what we're finding more and more is once you get to a certain threshold, in this case, once you start seeing these blue colors show up, that's the level of flooding. That's the flash flood emergency. This is some data telling us, hey, you really need to be watching out in these areas. If that's true, that much rainfall is falling there, and it's handling the soil conditions correctly, it's possible that you could have a flash flood emergency. And around this time, I think it was shortly before this time, even we're starting to hear that ramp up of reports. There are more water rescues occurring. Local authorities are looking for more resources. They're requesting more people to come in to get people out. You can just hear it ramping up when you communicate with dispatch centers and monitoring some of those frequencies. You start hearing that increase. So this is one of the tools that we use to determine, hey, it's time to kind of take the flood warning to the max level or the next level. So we're doing more and more research on this. We're going to continue to do that, and that'll improve certainly enhance flood warning services. So after all that, put all that information together, then we got to get the word out. So from there, we'll issue flash flood warning or flood warning, whatever it may be. Again, I grabbed some examples of the night of the flash flood emergency. We'll send out the warning, the text warning we call it or whatever, that goes out to the emergency alert system. That'll make your phones go off, received by dispatch centers. We'll go to social media on Facebook, and also we do Twitter as well, and we'll send out that information. This was one of the graphics example from that night. At that point, we had radar estimates of 5 to 12 inches of rain. We knew there was life-threatening flooding occurring. We've already had reports of evacuations, and we're hearing that ramp up in impacts. It goes out to the weather radio. Just really start getting the word out. That's where it's key. Partners that we work closely with to help share that message. Going to be a message multiplier for us, if you will, to get the word out, get people to safety. So that concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions here after this, and if you'd like to contact me or ever have any questions about anything weather related or river forecast related, there's my email on the slide. I'd be happy to take your questions. Do we have some time for questions?
Great. Thank you.